medal, so not exciting being rich. So mine's talking about more kind of day-to-day practices, working in professional football. So just a little bit of background on me. So I've got about 10 years experience working in professional football, so I'm currently still with Wolves Academy. So some of the things I'm going to be talking about today are part of that work that I do there. Also in addition to that, obviously lecturing at BCU on the sport and exercise nutrition programme and course leader for that. So just for those, just a very brief, quick 60 seconds overview of the role of nutrition for those that may not be aware, if it's kind of more of a coaching background. Typically use nutrition for mainly optimising fueling for training and matches, so nutrition has a massive role to play in terms of football players' performance, but also health as well. Maximising recovery, so nutrition is huge for maximising players' recovery, especially when they have multiple games in a week. So sometimes players might have 2 or 3 games in a week, so recovery is going to be a massive element of that. Also improving things like alertness and concentration, and strength and performance. Reducing the risk of injury and illness as well, so I'm going to talk about a little bit of case study regarding an injured player, but nutrition does have a huge role to play in that. Optimising training adaptations, how you can get the best out of their training programme. As much as we kind of periodise training programmes, we also need to periodise our nutrition to match that as well to get the best out of performance. And also managing body composition, so that's an element of nutrition as well, to make sure we're in good physical condition basically. So these are some of the key staff that typically as a nutritionist that I would work with. So for example, Pete and Rich already touched on some of these, but sports scientists, so I work a lot with the sports scientists, given they're with the players quite a lot. Psychologists, for example, as well, so for any kind of additional support, psychology is such an important element of nutrition as well, because we know what they should be doing, but actually getting them to change their behaviours is a whole new story, so psychologist is a key one too. Also the coaches, so again, being around the players a lot, having more of an influence. So the impact the coaches will have as well, which I'll talk about in a little bit from some research. For me as a nutritionist, the chef is really important as well. They're going to be the ones providing the food in terms of the food provision, either before training, after training, before games, after games. So really having as much influence and working with the chef is really important. Club doctor as well, so we have a lot of work with the club doctor that I need to do around things like blood tests, or if someone's got allergies or medical conditions, and also physiotherapists as well. Obviously players get injured and so forth, there'll be a lot of work with that. And it's not just these people here, there are a lot of other people outside of that, but these are just the key ones. So obviously if it's younger players, for example in an academy, you might be working with host families or parents, or also player care, for example. So this is just a very quick case study just to show you kind of how that might actually look in practice. So this, for example, is a 21-year-old player. He's a striker, he's just had a hamstring injury, so predicted kind of recovery time for that is going to be about 10 weeks. So we've got some basic stats there around his height and weight. Skin folds is a way that we measure body fat, so at the time it's 59 millimetres, and we've got estimated energy requirements there. So just to see how that would look like then, so after doing an initial consultation with the player, one of the key things that really came out as a key concern was inadequate energy intake, but also poor protein timing as well. So first point of call was liaising with the chef to make sure there's additional food provided, there's individualised nutrition plans as well, obviously monitoring along the way. Additional supplementation like creatine, for example, and fish oils, and also whey protein to help support muscle health and minimise any muscle loss during that injury process. And then liaising with the club doctor, so looking at vitamin D levels, for example, because we know that's really important for muscle health. So getting on board with the club doctor to get some blood tests done. We actually did find that he was quite low in terms of his vitamin D, so that was a little bit of a concern. So I worked with the physios, being as they were seeing him every single day, to make sure that vitamin D supplementation was administered daily. And then in terms of poor dietary practices, there were some poor dietary practices evidence, so we're doing things that shouldn't necessarily have done. So getting the coach on board to kind of reinforce those important habits and why that's so important for the player's recovery, for example. And also some key work along with the psychologist. So again, tapping into motivation. So what's actually going to motivate the player to eat healthier and improve his recovery in terms of injury. And then finally, body composition assessment. So referring on to the sports scientist to measure body composition. So we do that by something called skin folds assessment. And at the time, we said it was 59 millimetres. So we were going to monitor that regularly every 4 weeks just to make sure that didn't go too high. And also the MDT meetings were really important that we did those on a regular basis just to see how much the programme was changing for the player. So obviously I could then adapt the nutrition alongside that, because without me knowing what's going on with this training programme, then it's quite hard to plan a diet obviously around that. So just some key outcomes at the end of that. Skin folds was 61 mil, so yeah, they did go up by 2 millimetres, but tiny in the scheme of things, so we managed to kind of maintain that. Vitamin D levels increased as well, so basically normal levels, that's exactly where we wanted them to be. Things like improved energy intake, so we've done the analysis for that, and also improved protein timing, for example. Lots of other things around that as well, but those are just some of the key outcomes that we was interested in with this particular player. So just some coach insights on nutrition that I thought might be quite interesting. So I did some PhD research that involved interviewing lots of different coaches, sports nutritionists and players in the Premiership League, just to find out some qualitative information on what their perceptions were of nutrition. So one of the things, I've just pulled out some key things that I thought were quite interesting from coaches. So players definitely value advice from coaches. Now coaches often said they certainly wasn't an expert in nutrition, and of course they're not expected to be because that's a completely different discipline. But when they did speak to players about nutrition, they pretty much all of them said that players really value that information from them, especially obviously if they come from backgrounds of being a professional player themselves, for example. The players really kind of take on board that advice rather than necessarily coming from a nutritionist where the value might not be there as much as what it would be for a coach. Coaches said they don't feel they have the skills or knowledge to give nutrition advice, which again we certainly wouldn't expect, but they felt they did have a responsibility. So if they were noticing poor practices with a player, for example, that's when they were saying they'd almost step in and put something into place, so some kind of intervention, but obviously work alongside the nutritionist to do that. And a lot of them, kind of through these discussions of just finding out their perceptions, a lot of them said they were really sort of reflecting on including nutritionists more in their MDTs. So something that they want to kind of get the nutritionists into, which currently they don't do, because often, like Rich and Pete said, a lot of the nutritionists work remotely, so they're not necessarily there all the time. But getting them in is going to be really key. Coaches definitely reflected on communicating better. So I think there's that kind of theme of, okay, so if a player becomes injured, then it's the physio's responsibility. If a player, for example, has some issues with psychology, then obviously send them off to the psychologist. And it's very much like some of the coaches are saying that's then that discipline, and they just sort of throw them off to there. But actually, it's about integrating everyone together and understanding that more and communicating. Coaches were certainly keen to learn about nutrition. I was quite surprised at that, but that was something that they actually wanted to know more about. So they were kind of mentioning, maybe nutritionists could kind of get in and do some workshops for coaches to kind of help build some of that knowledge. Again, certainly nothing expert level, but just having some basic understanding and be able to give players knowledge on that. And then, which I tend to find a lot of the time, first team players, or certainly more senior players, are always a huge motivator for younger players specifically. So around what their practices are or being in their environment, for example. So a lot of our 23s players at Wolves, for example, they are with the first team quite a lot. So they're training with them, or they might have gone on pre-season with them, and that's a big motivator for players. Okay, and then to finish off with some challenges. So there are definitely some challenges working as part of a multidisciplinary team. So one of the key ones I often find is that when we have managers or head coaches, for example, in the past, obviously without saying club names or names, there was a head coach who, for example, didn't want players having carbohydrate foods the day before a game. So for me as a nutritionist, carbohydrate is absolutely essential for players to load their glycogen levels so they can perform at their best. So that has a direct impact on the performance. However, this particular head coach said that no carbohydrates the day before a game. So of course that kind of goes completely against what I'm trying to achieve as a practitioner, what I know is best for a player. So sometimes it's thinking about how you deal with that situation. Because what do you guys think might have happened if I'd have stood up to him and said, you're absolutely wrong, they need carbohydrates and they're going to have carbohydrates.
The new nutritionist then.
Exactly, you're at the door. So absolutely that. So as wrong as it is, as much as we all sit here and say that's really wrong, but that is the truth of what would happen. They know that you'd be irreplaceable quite quickly. So how you kind of manage those situations of working with other members of the team is really key. In that particular scenario, I found that simply doing things like sneaking in things like fruit juices, for example. Fruit juices are really high in carbs, but he didn't necessarily realise that they was. He thought they were fine because, again, he didn't have that nutrition knowledge and he didn't understand. So finding ways to kind of mix things in the dishes so that we knew the players were getting the carbohydrates in, but without it being obvious to him. Because there was a few different approaches used, like sitting down and showing the science and the evidence and papers, but not really interested. He's known it for his way for a long period of time, so it's going to stay that way. So our last kind of option was to almost sneak these carbohydrates into dishes, which is crazy, but it worked, and that's what we had to do. So just kind of really outlining that you do get those challenges when working with that, and again, it's just understanding they don't have the scientific background to understand what is important. I'd say communication, so same messages to player as well. So what I tend to find specifically in football, this might be different in different sports, but generally you'll have a manager or a head coach that might watch a football game and they might say, right, this player is too fat. And we go, well, we've done his skin folds and he's 60 millimetres, he's absolutely fine, he's within our target range. And they might be like, no, physically looking at him, he's too fat. So then obviously that's very challenging as well, because it's about trying to change their perceptions of that, and also making sure the player wants to achieve the same goals, because often the player might only be working on something because the coach has told him he needs to. So it's about understanding his motivations and why he wants to do it as well. And then I'd say there's a lot of strong characters, I think in sport in general, and different characters, and sometimes when you get 10 people in a room, sat down, all with different areas of expertise, then it can get a little bit challenging. And I think wherever possible, to have data to provide to evidence what you're trying to show is really important. So certainly within the club that I work at, we try and provide as much data, whether it's around how much their rest and energy needs, or how much they're physically intaking in terms of calories, or even looking at GPS results and things like that. Because if you have data in front of you, it's hard for someone to argue with you. Whereas without the data, things like nutrition can be quite hard to analyse without any specific data. So yeah, that is basically finishing off with the challenges. I've probably done a bit quicker than I was meant to, but yeah, I think Alan's going to open up to questions anyway, aren't you now? So.
Yeah, thanks very much.